Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 6, Section 2, Developmental History of Yixing Mining, Part 1, Early Mining. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongzun Li.
大家好.
Hello, Pat. Hello, Zongzun. My first question. Mining was already a well-developed industry throughout China, long before zisha wares came into vogue. How did the established mining industry affect early practices in Yixing? What did they adopt and what did they adapt in Yixing specifically for zisha clay?
Well, I didn't read the, let's just guess, somewhere between 100 and 1,000 pages of tin mining documents that, Jason, you had to scour to thoroughly write this book. So what I'm saying is going to be a guess. I would think that some of the shaft mining technology, right, would be adapted. There's no reason that some of the tools could not move over, right, from the metal mining industry towards clay mining industry. I would think where they would need to adapt would be the deposit of ore is likely not stratified in the same way that we see zisha ore, as we've discussed extensively in the past 2 or 3 podcasts. And so the way that they approach the collection of that ore and then how they continue moving down throughout that mining shaft, the patterns that they would following zisha ore versus following a tin or a copper ore would probably be very different and would change the way that the shaft itself, right, the tunnel develops and how far down they potentially could go, how far down they need to go. I'm not aware really of how far some of these metals are under the ground. So I'm sure a lot of the structures are very similar, but as you kind of delve deeper into how the ore itself impacts the approach industrially, I'm sure that's where we'll see it differ. So Zongjun, maybe you can speak more to it, but if not, Jason, I think we're both interested in hearing your thoughts on how they're different.
I would say for early minings of zisha, a lot of the techniques are very similar to minings of other, ores or minerals. And the mining condition is generally pretty dangerous. The supporting structure of the shaft and the mining techniques and the tools are still very primitive in the early days. It was really during the communist era when they start to implement, industrial equipment into the mining site that we are seeing a more drastic development of new mining techniques.
I would agree with both of what you've said thus far. Speaking of the dangers in the mine, when we think about Yixing mining, when we talk about zisha ore mining, we talk about it as if it's a good thing because our art depends on it. Yet mining itself is a difficult and dangerous job. So what dangers specifically did the miners face?
Oxygen levels, right? So as you go deeper into the mines, right, the level of oxygen in the air that you're breathing is going to be dropping and dropping. And I do think you write as much about the, let's call it technology, right, that they developed to have some kind of warning system, right, as to if they've reached an area in the mine where the oxygen is too low. So I think having some kind of torch lit, right, I think you write something about that. But then certainly just the physical labor aspect, right, of being in a small confined space, having to do hard manual labor that involves like bending down a lot, picking things up is sure to be backbreaking. But speaking more about breaking backs, if you mine the wrong area and everything collapses, then you're going to have a really bad day if you come back. So lots of, I don't know, snakes, spiders, tigers. It just keeps going. The list of dangers just keeps going.
Yeah, and also a lot of hydraulic damage to the shaft mine occurs over and over again in different mining sites in the history. You see, because like Yixing in general is close to Taihu. During the rainy season, you get like a lot of precipitation in the regional areas. Correct me if I'm wrong, but even in the later days, like shaft mine number 4, number 5, a lot of them are abandoned because of water damage. I believe part of shaft mine, sorry, I really forgot which number, but it's still under the water.
Some were flooded, some were purposely flooded, particularly Big Water Pond.
And also Dashuitan, a lot of the open pit mine. It's called Dashuitan because, it used to be an open mine site, but now it's a big water pond.
But shaft mine number 4 was purposely closed. It wasn't flooded.
Right.
I think all of that just adds more, though, to the appreciation, right, we need to have for the ware, right? Just thinking about how much hard work and danger goes into just extracting the ore. It's just another reason to really be thankful that we even have this material.
Speaking of that appreciation that we have for Yixing ore because of the dangers of mining it, what was the balance of the market? How did the market respond to labor supply versus ore yield?
Assumably, since there was a shift from, I think, more government managed to more private industry, I would assume that at some point commercial factors came in and where people would no longer potentially work either conscripted or paid for whatever the government wage was. I assume that the private wage must have been slightly or substantially better for them to continue working in this industry. Zongzun or Jason, your thoughts?
I would say that that's likely unclear. One of the frequent questions about China is why there wasn't ever wage pressure, or why there was such a lack of industrialization in early China. And one of the potential answers to that is that China has historically had an oversupply of labor, which meant that you weren't very high on the demand. There was a lot of elasticity in supply in the labor market. And so you never had to actually increase wages. There was always a ready workforce available. And so that had the effect of allowing companies to underinvest in mechanization and automation and industrialization, which potentially allowed China to develop quickly early, but then held China back from developing an industrialized economic base.
Yeah, I will largely agree on that. And I also found a reference of the water damage was occurred in shaft mine number 5 in Huanglongshan in the 1990s.
Returning to the original question around mining and mining technology and how the extant mining industry already in China played a role into the development of Yixing, what was the role of government in mining during the Ming dynasty? And how did that role change and evolve after the transition to the Qing dynasty?
Well, Ming dynasty was notoriously good at exploring resources across the country, not just minerals, but also a lot of other natural resources like wood. In later Ming dynasty, they were running out of large wood supply to build new palaces, that they developed a new method to join smaller wood branches to create the Ming supporting pillars in new palaces in later Ming dynasty. But that also, applied to mining. A lot of the mining sites were largely exploited to the end, and which led to a suspension of further mining during Qing dynasty. But I believe the suspension was quickly revert after demand of Yixing increases during, late Kangxi era.
To what Zongzun was saying, right? We see this transition from the Ming to the Qing, where the Qing continues a lot of what was done in the mining industry. But one of the major themes that we see differently, and you write as much in the chapter, is that the philosophy and the way of thought in the Qing was, the state philosophy of Neo-Confucianism. And we discussed a lot in the first book, the idea of Gewu, right? This exploration of things. And so the Qing likely had a different approach in the way that they systemized, right, the concepts, both from a craft perspective, but also from the industry's perspective in mining. So I think that's one of the major probably changes we see in the approach to mining in the Qing, and is probably the lasting impact really from that dynasty as well.
Did mining have an impact on the development of other unrelated technologies?
I think the industry of mining, and particularly when more private industry gets involved and it becomes more commercialized with the merchant class, new ways of accounting, right? New accounting technology comes out of this mining industry, which is just maybe not the most fascinating new technology to come out, but it is interesting to think that an industry could spawn an entire new form of stock ventures or accounting.
That's interesting.
I found that to be one of the more interesting developments. Not that I have such an interest in accounting, but the idea that China was predominantly a bankingless society. Right? There weren't lenders, there weren't money lenders in a history of banking transactions that had taken place in China as there was in the development of the Western world. And so you see the privatization of the mining by the merchant class. The merchant class doesn't have enough hard assets, particularly fungible cash. They have to raise cash. And what they wind up doing is re-implementing their own bankingless version of a joint stock company. And that paid out profits and a profit share after the mine was developed, and then could raise new money again for additional mine expansion or continuous extraction or to the development of new shafts. And when you think about that, you think, okay, well, what exactly was necessary for the industrialization of China, right? We know that it had some version of, we could say, the resource curse. The resource curse is a contemporary theory that says countries that have an overabundance of resources fail to industrialize and diversify their economies, which means that though they make profit in the short run, they tend to develop top-down heavy government power structures that run off the revenue of the resources versus the enrichment of the society. China had obviously a flourishing society, both politically and artistically. They had an interesting cultural society, but they had an oversupply of labor, which we already discussed. They were very good at resource extraction because of that labor, right? They were running out of wood, they were running out of other material resources. That led to some level of technological development, a spurring of technology, for example, the construction of wood for pillars, wood jointery. They were determined how to build ships, seafaring, seagoing ships from smaller wood resources. They moved from burning wood to burning other materials for kiln firings. So we know that there was some level of positive feedback loop in that development, and yet they still never industrialized. And you say, okay, well, they never industrialized during the dynastic period. And you say, okay, well, what was the role of the economic position in that? And so you have this quasi non-banking ability for independent entity interactions that really did spur continuous resource extraction. And so was it just a labor supply problem, or was there something else going on? And this is a topic that we'll actually return to in the next chapter. So it's something that we're actively thinking of. But I think when you think about Yixing mining, we're talking about the specific ores and the deposits, and we get to this extraction, and then we say, okay, well, what other things did this develop? And you start to say, well, it developed a new system for bookkeeping, and that bookkeeping was necessary because it developed an entire system of joint stock companies, which was necessary because the government said we're promoting independent mining and the allowance of the merchants to get deeper into resource extraction, right? And this interaction with the government, you realize that it's actually a much bigger question, and that all of this was very much interrelated. And so that I will stop there. That was a longer statement than I had intended to make.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. I would argue that the prototype of banking system or accounting system was not a unique case in the mining industry. We have been seeing similar societies and communities being developed during the late Ming dynasty, especially in the fabric manufacture and textile manufacture industry along the Jiangnan region. But it was quickly destroyed and shut down due to the collapse of Ming. And early Qing, I would also argue that the hierarchical, government structure, the very totalitarian control of the Qing government has a lot of impact on, privatization of business, or how general public are allowed to do certain business in the early days. We do see a booming capitalization of different kinds of industry in, later Qing dynasty, especially when they start to observe how Japan is quickly rising after the Meiji Revolution. But I would say there are a lot of joint factors that impact the delay of industrialization in China.
Well, wouldn't you also say that the government, through its interaction with merchants, did it protect, or did it propagate, or did it delay further development? Right. So in the Qing, local government mandarins were allowed to invest and work with the merchant class. And actually it was seen as a form of good governance for them to invest in industry in their regions. On the other hand, that meant that whatever industry that they invested in, or whatever specific group that they invested in, they had a predisposition for. Maybe they turned a blind eye, maybe that there was various forms of corruption, right? But it was actually seen as a form of good governance at that time. So do you have evidence or examples of where that accelerated or prevented better development, or halted the progressions of development?
Yeah, no, not on top of my head.
Well, we
but
can think of
it's
positive examples, right? We can think of positive examples in Yixing. We know that Hui Mengchen was a
Mm.
literati Mandarin stationed in Yixing who came to adopt and enjoy the arts of Yixing, invested in mining and extraction, paid for the commissioning of wares, right? So we know that there's positive examples, but do we know on balance if that type of investment was positive or negative? I mean, did the top-down Confucian culture really constrict people to being good governors? Or was there obvious levels of corruption prevalent in society, or did it change over time?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. For governance like Hui Mengchen, their commissioning of zisha was largely pretty small scale. It was to individual ceramists and Yixing artists. It wasn't really like a well-established, a zisha factory or some sort, which I would argue that it's probably a proto structure of a positive impact from the government to local business, but I wouldn't say that systematically it was creating a new structure or a new societal norm from what we've been seeing in late Ming Dynasty.
Yeah, I assume there's no way to know on balance, as you said, Jason, right? Whether we saw, protection, propagation, corruption. Thinking about, as you mentioned, the ideals of the government, right, being Confucian led. From that Confucian ideals perspective, yes, as a governor, right, you should be trying to live up to this, right, filial piety, taking care of and being the best person you could be in your role. And that would be probably very important, right? Not just to the governors who are taking tests, right, to become these literati, and part of these tests are really structured within the Confucian mindset. But on the whole, who knows? Likely, yes, there was lots of corruption going on. I would be interested in what the first principles research that you guys have been doing really shows at that time.
China had a habit of only recording the positive examples. We know that corruption was widespread in the late Qing. It does not seem, the histories do not give a picture that there was widespread corruption in the early through mid-Qing. Would you agree with that, Zongzun?
Yeah, probably, but we really don't know.
The histories themselves are biased. We're admitting that, right? What we're saying is that the common conception within China at the time was not a corrupt government from early Qing through until late Qing.
Yeah, Kangxi, Yongzheng, Tianlong, they're probably smaller corruption compared to later period of time during Qing Dynasty. We do know that Daoguang, Emperor Daoguang, was famously lived a very simple life, trying to save money for the government because at that time we do see a very low store inventory or national storage of silver in the Qing Bank due to various reasons, like war and corruption and poor management of agriculture. They do experience some bad seasons in mid-Qing. But the general perception is, smaller corruption in the beginning and more larger scale corruption in later Qing, not just in the bottom part of the Mandarin class, but also, like Cixi was famously, notoriously being big money spender of building new gardens instead of building new Navy ships.
And that's not unique though to the Qing though, right? I mean, I think we see that as every dynasty kind of crests and comes to, collapse, usually corruption is where one of the fingers is pointed to for blame.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. As they say for Cixi, cement boats don't float. But
You sure that was Sushi? I feel like I heard that from The Godfather.
Similar,
probably quote each other.
Similar meaning. The Godfather was very up to date on their Chinese literati imperial sayings. The one thing. So Qianlong, after he became father emperor, right after he became when he somewhat resigned and spent time in his personal garden inside the Forbidden City, a lot of the government still reported to him, and a lot of the eunuchs began to there was widespread corruption amongst the eunuchs that didn't get wiped out until after his death. One of the other things, though, returning to what Zongzun said about Hui Mengchen and whether or not it was small scale or was it large scale, right? One of the questions is, well, Hui Mengchen was dialed in to the entire literati culture, and in some versions of history as it's written, he was responsible for revitalizing the trade and the desire of Yixing at the high end. And so can we really say that it was only, small scale or favoring specific artists when the reintroduction of Yixing to the tea practices and the revitalization of the high end of the Yixing market revolved around him, or was that inevitable?
Interesting question.
I'm not sure I'm convinced one way or another, but I'm not convinced that the argument that it was a small scale set of commissions means that it didn't have reverberating and major impacts, particularly when it influenced other individuals to buy. Right? We see this today. Right? There are a small scale category out there. Someone who's very famous says, "Oh, I love X brand," or "I love X thing," and then suddenly everyone's buying that thing, right?
I totally agree with you. My argument was actually it didn't really triggered or reach to a tipping point that start a industrialization or capitalization of Yixing mining or Yixing making as a new type of business or new type of capitalism structure within the Qing dynasty, because like the Qing, the literatis, the mandarins, the emperors, the monarchs are still very largely influenced by Confucius' idea that merchants being the bottom class of the typical four classes, 士农工商, right? Mandarin comes first, and then it's the workers, and then it's the farmers, and then it's the workers, and then it's the merchants. That's my argument, but I do agree with you that commission of famous artists during that time did help Yixing to reach a higher point of artistic accomplishment. And also people are start to talking about Yixing artists, like before Qing, I would say a lot of the artists behind the Yixing wares or ceramics wares are largely nameless. There isn't a position for them to being talked about during the appreciation of ceramics or
craftsmen. Right, they were craftsmen, not artists.
They're just craftsmen. They're not artists. But it was really in Qing dynasty that their status being elevated into a new point, and people start to talk about their names and correlate their names with artistic styles or artistic excellence.
But on the economic development point, it sounds like you have a Chinese education, because it's a structuralist argument. It's literally a Marxist argument.
Would you say it's a correct argument?
We don't know if it's correct or not, right? But it's the structure of the system that didn't allow for the progression of the economic development. It didn't industrialize at the time, which meant that it could never reach a more utopian communist future.
It's always a class struggle, Jason.
Well, the problem is they kept the merchants on the bottom.
Well, I mean, that has been historically the case, throughout history of China. Like merchant in Chinese history has never been, on top of the society. Especially in Ming dynasty, we've been seeing like family of Shen in Jiangnan region making banks, but eventually they are all tumbling down because of the heavy-handed government involvement.
Well, everyone, that's all the time that we have for this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Developmental History of Yixing Mining, Modern Mining.